Evening to everyone joining us virtually for today's Concordia Live. My name is Hannah Dalman. I'm the Senior Director of Partnerships here at Concordia, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion, co-designed and hosted in partnership with Concordia's global patron member, Bayer. For those of you joining us as guests of either Bayer or one of our speakers, welcome. Concordia is a New York-based nonprofit dedicated to promoting public-private partnerships and positive social impact through our Convene, Connect, Create model of member benefits. We're best known for our annual convening, which serves as the preeminent global forum alongside the UN General Assembly each fall. And this year, we're very excited to be hosting it in a hybrid fashion. But we also have a robust year-round program, as well as dedicated team members that support our members in their partnership design, growth, and implementation services. So we're a very active group and really just trying to catalyze how SDG 17 and public-private partnerships are contributing to the 2030 agenda. I'm so pleased that we're able to collaborate with Bayer today on this important topic. As some of you may have seen, Concordia yesterday announced a public digital event set for June 23rd, tackling the topic of sustainability with a domestic US lens. In partnership with Rubicon, we'll be holding public and private programming that day, designed to elevate and accelerate public-private partnerships as part of America's strategy to meet our climate goals and global commitments. I'd encourage the folks from today's Concordia Live to also save that date for June 23rd, and of course to reach out to Bayer or Concordia in the interim if today's experts spark ideas or opportunities for collaboration. So I know we're all experts in the Zoom space, but a few tips and tricks to make the most out of the next 45 minutes, especially if you're less familiar with the SpotMe platform that you're viewing through. First, listeners are encouraged to use the Q&A feature of the SpotMe to ask questions. Towards the end of the session, at around the 9:30 mark, our moderator, Ms. Bokova, will ask panelists these questions. So please send them in advance and so that we can make sure that we're really integrating you into today's conversation. For any non-questions, but more so fun facts, the connect element is central to everything that we do, especially in this digital era. So I encourage you to use the newsfeed or the chat feature on the SpotMe platform to introduce yourself, where you're coming from, why you're interested in this conversation, and to share any relevant work that you're doing related to deforestation or other topics that our speakers bring in. This will be monitored by the Concordia team members, and from time to time, Concordia will also be dropping in relevant links related to the remarks made by our experts, so do keep an eye on it. You can take this conversation external, tagging @Concordia Summit or @Bayer for any of our speakers on social media. And this webinar will, of course, be recorded and available on Concordia's website, along with a summary of today's conversation. So, before I turn over to our moderator, former Director General of UNESCO and Concordia Leadership Council member Irina Bokova, who will, of course, introduce this topic in full, I'd like to welcome each of our experts to this discussion. And as Irina was saying beforehand, we are just humbled by the range of experience and leadership shown by each of our experts and the good work that they're doing every single day. So I can't wait to turn off my mic and listen in. So we have Matthias Berninger. He's the Senior Vice President of Public Affairs and Sustainability at Bayer. We have Leslie Weldon, Chief Executive of the Forest Service for Work Environment and Performance Office of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Andrea Guimaraes, the head of the Amazon Environmental Research, EPAM, Amazonia, and Olumaseun Adekugbe, Managing Director of Youth for Nature. So with this diverse set of voices, experiences, and perspectives on deforestation, it's my sincerest pleasure to turn over to Irina Bokova to take us into the conversation. Irina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you for this presentation. And I'm extremely pleased to be here with you, both as a former Director General of UNESCO and also as the member of the Leadership Council of Concordia, and to be among this so distinguished panel of committed experts, practitioners, and scientists. We know that forests play a very vital role for sustaining life on Earth. Nowadays, we speak about sustainability more and more, particularly when we are overcoming, hopefully, the COVID-19 pandemic that has devastated many communities around the world. We know that almost 1.6 billion people, including more than 2,000 indigenous cultures, depend on forests for their livelihoods, medicine, fuel, food, and shelter. And we know also how much it is important for the implementation, achievement of the Sustainable Development Agenda of the United Nations 2030 for very many different SDG goals. We can mention 11, 15, but not only. And particularly for me as a former Director General of UNESCO, today's discussion is important. It resonates very deeply with my experience because more than 110 World Heritage sites are recognized as, the forests are recognized as World Heritage sites. They may range from 18 hectares as the Vallée du Mai in the Seychelles, or to more than 5 million hectares, Central Amazon Conservation Complex. And I'm sure that André Guimaraes knows very well this. The World Heritage Forest sites now have a total surface area of over 75 million hectares. It means 1.5 times the surface of France. And forests, we know, filter the air we breathe, they mitigate climate change, and are home of some 80% of terrestrial world's biodiversity. So I will go now into the debate. We have really a fantastic panel. My first question, I will turn to Matthias Berninger here, who is with us. I have to ask you something, Matias, because I have listening very recently to one of your YouTube videos, extremely interesting, when you were saying that sustainability and business strategy are one and the same strategy, and that it should be at the core, it's the fundamental of any business strategy of any company. I think what is at stake nowadays, of course, is the involvement, the commitment of the private sector, and what you have also mentioned many times, that the collaboration of the multi-stakeholder approach is critical. Partnerships are critical to address the problems of deforestation. Could you please elaborate on this idea?
Yes, thank you, Irina. I mean, when I look at business strategies, I usually don't look at the flashy sustainability reports. I look at two very important elements. One is, are business leaders rewarded for achieving sustainability impact? So are there quantitative targets that are really part of how a leader is being paid? In the case of Bayer, 20% of the long-term incentives are linked to achieving non-financial targets, and they are measured in the same way you would measure financial KPIs. The other thing I look at is the R&D budgets. There are around $350 billion R&D budgets in the top 50 companies in the world. In the case of Bayer, it's 5.5 billion euros in this case that we invest every year in R&D. And from my vantage point, if the R&D budgets aren't aligned with sustainability, we won't achieve the momentous change we need to achieve. So those are the two very important factors. And only after that, I look at commitments, like commitments to achieving the global goals on sustainable development, or curbing deforestation, or achieving carbon neutrality by the mid of the century. For me, those commitments are not as meaningful if the other two elements aren't included as well.
Thank you very much. You mentioned innovation. I think it's very important, and you yourself has been mentioning in many of the interviews, and in your current position at Bayer, which is very important, I guess, the role of science, including with innovation. So could you a little bit elaborate more on that? I think it becomes now ever more important, and how to make this interface between science, business, and politics and political leaders.
I recently read a figure that for me is really important in the whole deforestation discussion. In 2015, in September actually, China achieved a record in importing grains. They in one single month imported 4.1 million tons of grains. In January of this year, a new record was established, and that's 6 million tons of grains that China imported. That's a consequence of China fighting extreme poverty, but also a consequence of people consuming differently and more. And the only way for us to avoid that land use change and forest destruction is the consequence of this change in global demand is if we include a very radical innovation agenda. In short, we need to be able to produce more on much less land, and we need to innovate beyond just that, for example, in alternatives to traditional meat production. And these innovations are possible, but they require now really also the support of society. So for me, innovation alone is not the solution. So you need to do both. You need to have really good forest protection laws, and you need to stimulate innovation so that farmers can make money producing what's demanded in the world markets, but at the same time, nature is protected.
Thank you very much. We will come back to this question. I think what you mentioned is extremely important. This is indeed the reconciliation, if I may say so, about the different goals of poverty alleviation or food production, food security, but also keeping the biodiversity. It's the big issue of the SDG agenda. But before that, I would like to ask Leslie, if you allow me, Leslie, to come to invite you to the conversation, because I think it's very important that partnerships that are created, they also create an ecosystem of intervention. And I would like to ask you, with your experience, long experience that you have in government, in the protection of forests and parks, what are the underlying drivers, such as job opportunity or resource management, education, that must accompany any solution on a long-term basis?
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and glad this conversation is occurring and really glad to be with all of you. So this question about partnerships, and when I think of it as responsible for federal land management, immediately I think about the fact that the lands that we manage, the forest estate under the National Forest System, belongs to every citizen. They're immersed and close to communities, and there's been a dependency through time, most notably that the water, the majority of the water that our citizens drink flow and are produced by healthy forest. So the drivers that need to be in place to help with this idea of co-leadership and collaboration are really ensuring that the voices of all who are connected to these landscapes are included as we begin to look at solutions and decisions. In the Forest Service, we've had a lot of success with this idea of collaboration, where rather than us as a federal agency describing and saying what needs to happen to care for these lands, we create situations where we can hear the points of view and what's important about these lands today and the future. And that does include things like livelihoods and the future availability of water, the ability to support the biological diversity. And as we do that, we're able to learn in different ways, including from a lot of our indigenous and tribal communities, what it takes to truly look at the long-term health of these lands. And from that, we see that there's lots of opportunities for different contributions in skills, knowledge, expertise, but also resources, because we're also engaging with, local, regional, and national other governments. There's a federal government, then there are states, there's local communities. And we're seeing that as there's this shared understanding, among everyone of what's important, then we have more success in designing and implementing much larger scale projects for the longer term, that we can get the types of investments and funding and in-kind services and research in place to really make a difference. So we think that it's really important to continue to strive and grow into that kind of collaboration and partnership. One thing that I wanted to note too was the incredible role that we're seeing emerge out of a lot of our nonprofit organizations who come with a skill set and even access to underrepresented communities that we as a federal government have a more difficult time developing relationships with. And that's really helping to accelerate our ability to solve problems and get solutions together to care for the forests we have and to make sure that they can continue to grow and be as sustainable as possible. So thank you so much. I appreciate that question.
Thank you very much, Leslie. You said something which I think is very important. You're speaking about the long term. we speak about partnerships and efforts, we're speaking about long term. And I think this is extremely important because we know that today two words probably define all the policies. It's sustainability and resilience. And particularly when we speak about biodiversity, this is something that is high on the mind of politicians, but also on the civil society and on the expert community. Now, I'm turning to André Guimaraes. I have read a couple of your interviews, which is very interesting because you know very well that what happens in the Amazon is very high on the political agenda of the world. Also, as I said, because the Central Amazon Conservation Complex is the largest protected area under the auspices of UNESCO. It's 6 million hectares, one of the richest regions on the planet in terms of biodiversity, of different ecosystems, of forests, of lakes, of channels, and you may continue the list. So you have a lot of experience also as a scientist, but also working in the private sector and working in the different institutions. What, from your point of view today, is the most relevant strategy? Or if I may say it, what have the past efforts from your experience have given it, and what we can learn from them, please?
Thank you, Irina. Thank you, Concordia and Bayer for inviting me here. It's an honor to share the stage with such distinguished colleagues. And well, I think the answer to your question is that we have to shift the paradigm, Irina. We've been, let's look at the Amazon and the Brazilian Amazon as just as an example, because at some extent, this is happening in Indonesia, in Africa, in Latin America in general, in the tropical world in general. We have been living through a paradigm of as I like to call the expansion paradigm, or the expansionist paradigm. We need to occupy more and more land in order to continue the production of goods and food and services for the 7 billion inhabitants, human inhabitants of this planet. That paradigm has to change. If you look at the Brazilian case, 40 years ago, Brazil was a net importer of foods. Now, 40 years later, Brazil is one of the largest producers and exporters of agricultural commodities in the world. That's a success story, but there is a hidden angle there, which is we lost 50% of the Cerrado in Brazil, the central savannas, and we lost nearly 20% of the Amazon. That process can't continue as it goes. It has to change. So in order to change that, under the complexity that you perfectly described, we need to engage the different sectors of the society. As Dr. Weldon mentioned, I mean, it has to be a collaborative effort. We need to engage science, we need to engage corporations, all the intelligence of companies like Bayer and so many others, the public policies, they have to go in a different direction. There is no way we can continue the human development on this planet at the expense of the tropical forests, at the expense of traditional communities, indigenous communities, worldwide. I mean, we have to redesign this paradigm of the expansionism into what I like to call the paradigm of intensification. As Matias mentioned, we need to produce more in less area. That's the challenge that we have. And that in achieving that objective, I think we will at the same time be able to survive and to have good quality of life worldwide, at the same time that we protect nature and protect the environmental services for the future generations. I think that's the must do for our generation. As President Obama said once, and I fully agree, we are the generation that do understand the problem and do have the responsibility to solve the problem at the same time. And I think we are in a moment in which we have to put our brains together to move to the next level, to move to the next paradigm.
Thank you very much, Andre. I think what you mentioned is extremely important. You spoke about changing the paradigm. You spoke about a different model, not the extension model of developing agriculture, economy, whatever. And I think this is the most difficult part of it, because scientists have spoken about that for a very long time, civil society, expert community. And now is the time, I think, for the political action to make this happen. And this is where, once again, I think partnerships will make a big difference. There is a question from the audience, which is very much linked to what you said. And allow me to mention it here. There was a question about, it's a great conversation. We agree with this conversation, but how we make this move from a conversation to action, and how we scale up this action. And I think Amazon is a very, right a little bit. And
I'm sorry, Irina, I think I missed the last part of your comment. It broke for me.
I was saying that there was a question from the audience that was saying that it's a great conversation. The question is, and the difficulty is, how to move from conversation to action. Mm-hmm. And linked to that is how we scale up this action, possible action.
Okay, very briefly, I think it's a complex process and it's a complex solution. But from where I am as a leader of a science-based organization, I think we need, and I'm speaking to myself included, I think we need to communicate better to the general public what are the risks that we are involved in and what are the potential solutions to what we have to achieve in the future. For example, 90% of the Brazilian agriculture is non-irrigated. It depends upon natural water cycles. So protecting the Amazon is a good business for Brazil. Brazil depends upon its agribusiness sector, 25% of our GDP. And once again, that goes for Bolivia, that goes for Colombia, that goes for Kenya, that goes for DRC, that goes for Indonesia, for Thailand, for Cambodia, for Vietnam. All of those countries, they depend upon natural cycles of water, for example, in order to produce their GDP. So get people to understand that rationale, I think it's very important. So science needs to translate fancy graphics and fancy tables and complex math analysis into simple ways to get people to understand that we are going to a risky situation and we need to revert that. So from when I see things, Irene, I think we need to be able to produce and communicate these challenges on a more simple way to the general public so that they can act when they vote, when they decide, when they consumption decisions and so on and so forth. So I think information and better channel through the general public is one of the key aspects of this revolution that we need to promote in the coming decades.
Thank you, Andrea. I think you raised two important questions. The role of the science and how it's communicated in a language that is understandable, but also, as I mentioned, the interface between science and policy, that political leaders and politicians respect the opinion of scientists. And the second, you mentioned something very important. It is the interlinkages between the different areas of sustainability. You can't solve the problem of the forests if you don't solve the problem of the food security and sustainable agriculture. You can't solve the problem of water management without linking it once again to the cultural diversity or the community diversity of communities. I think all these interlinkages are very important. And you mentioned that communicating to the public is important. So I'm coming to Olumaseun, our young participant here in this debate, because she has been a great advocate, not only in Nigeria, I would say, but within the United Nations on the eco-sustainability, on protection of the forests, working also with indigenous communities in sustainable forest management and leading this very strong advocacy. I have seen also, Olumaseun, that you have been working with the RED program, one of major United Nations programs that I was involved also in Indonesia through UNESCO. And I think it's very important that this way of programs reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries to translate it to our public what read. My question to you is, what is your experience from that point of view? And what you think also is needed for Africa? We know that Nigeria is an extraordinary country in biodiversity with the huge challenges once again in the protection of their forests. We know that there have been different initiatives launched in Africa, the Green Wall project in Africa. What are your thoughts? Could you share it with us?
All right, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be part of this discussion because every time I get to be part of discussions on forests, it gives me great joy that at least we are looking into the right direction. Because I think right now in the whole world, everybody knows how important forest is to us, but then this forests keep on disappearing every now and then. And it's just keep me asking, what are we not doing right? Or what are we doing wrong? And I think for Africa, it's quite alarming. From Nigeria right now, we can say like 96% of our primary forests are gone. And then it's same thing for all over Africa. So I think one of the things that working with UN Red, or just say working as a flogger for UN Red, and I got to interact with indigenous communities around forest areas, I was able to understand the fact that there was no proper knowledge dissemination, no proper awareness programs. And it seems like the indigenous communities are the people that are very close to forests. They are the ones that depend on forest resources for their livelihoods, but then they are being segregated from where decisions about forest and forest resources management is being made. They are being there's no proper awareness and education for them. And even this is one of the examples that I saw in the UN Red work in Nigeria. It seems like I went about asking rural communities, asking indigenous people if they understand what UN Red program was all about, but then none of them had the understanding. So it seems to me like only the government really knows what that program was made for, but then there should be a kind of interaction between the indigenous communities, and then because they are the people that really work with forests, and then they cannot be excluded when it comes to forest resources. And I think there's a lot of programs coming up, and then I think they are getting it in the place of, okay, let's provide another source of livelihood for forest communities so that they less depend on the forest. But then how are we doing this successfully? Are we coming through I'm thinking there's a way, there should be a link between the indigenous communities and this program. Every bridge between that should be broken. And then for the Great Green Wall projects, I'm being positive about this, because right now what I'm reading about this is that by 2030, the wall aims to restore 100 million acres of the degraded land. So I'm positive if this is going to happen, then that will be fine, because right now Africa cannot wait any moment to make sure that every land that has been degraded is restored. But then what I think we should look into in making sure that this is a realistic program is to empower the local communities to see the values of forest resources, not just as a means of livelihood, but as a prerequisite to a safe environment. We should understand, and everyone right around the world should understand, that forest is very important, and then is important just as a safe environment, and a safe environment is important as the economic development that we want to see around the world. So we must respect this and act rightly. And then another thing that I noticed that is really affecting a lot of programs coming on in Africa is the fact that we don't we practice what they call mutual exclusivities of forest communities. In as much as we continue to exclude the difference between livelihoods and conservation, then most of these programs are not going to work, especially when it comes to the communities that are living close to the forest. There has to be a kind of alternative source of livelihoods, alternative source of dependence for these people for rural communities to understand that restoration is needed. And I think another thing that I want to emphasize is the fact that we need to also work towards the area of disputes, because I see this is one of the reasons why conservation efforts is frustrated in Nigeria. There is no proper land tenure management, and then there's always a dispute between the government and the indigenous communities, and then this results in a lot of conflict. So I think defining these terms and then bringing the rural communities into the decision-making process for all of these programs that are coming on will really make a lot of change when it comes to management of forest or restoration of degraded lands.
Thank you very much. You mentioned something very important. You mentioned about the need, as Andre, of communicating, of educating. I do believe that globally education for sustainable development is extremely interesting and important nowadays. And by the way, next week there will be a big conference on education for sustainable development organized jointly by UNESCO and the federal government of Germany. It continues a lot of work. And in goal number 4 on education for sustainable development is a specific target. And I think this is very important to be embraced by governments, but also to have kind of a societal consensus. And I come back to Matthias, who in this, you mentioned, Matias, in one of your talks that I have seen on YouTube, the necessity of such a societal consensus, working with the local communities, so working with governments, working with innovation in science to find the right solutions, because definitely the extensive way of developing agriculture is not the way forward. We know that, and Andre mentioned it. And you said, Matthias, something very interesting, that we have to embrace inconvenient truths. Could you elaborate a little bit on what you had in mind?
If you look at the latest reports on biodiversity published in 2019, and I probably get the letter suit wrong here, of IPPES or whatever that the panel's name is, it's not as famous as the reports we've seen from IPCC on climate change, but it's equally scary, and we need to embrace that data. And Andre, I'm sure you have contributed to that data set. What we know is the loss of nature has to be stopped. And to be very honest, one of the key challenges that I see is that the time between us understanding and us solving a problem is just taking too long. So we had a good start in curbing deforestation, slowing down the rates after the 1992 Rio conference, which was 20 years after the first conference in Stockholm, and it just takes too long. We realized that we reshape the conditions under which we live, and that's why I was extremely happy to see a bit of action as well. So during President Biden's conference just a few weeks ago on climate, you saw a lot of commitments, including a really great commitment of the Brazilian government. I totally agree with the commitment. I just don't agree with the inability of delivering against it. So governments need to deliver against their commitment, and the same is true for business. And one example, Irina, that drives my optimism at the moment is an initiative that Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States government started. They basically said they invited businesses who are committed to the UN Race to Zero on climate change to put money into a fund that will amount to $1 billion a year, perhaps even more. And that money will be invested now in communities that protect their livelihoods and that both protect and also improve the conditions of their forests. These are the kind of partnerships we need, because they're connecting communities with climate change, with water conservation, with nature conservation, and they also help removing carbon out of the atmosphere. And the partnership between governments on the one side, business on the other side, then linked to communities that really own those forests as their livelihoods, is one of the keys. The only thing is we need to accelerate pace here.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's indeed a very important initiative. I will turn now to Leslie and ask her what, from your point of view, is the most urgent action that we have to take up, we have to initiate? Or in other words, if you look back and we just on a level ground, where do we start now in the current circumstances?
Thank you. I really appreciated hearing Olumaseun, Matthias, and Andre, because everyone has been talking about this theme of activation. Because when I look at the state of our science, in our management techniques, they're all there. We know what it takes on the ground per se to make a difference for the long term. So the other part of activation is in paradigm shift, and is extremely important, is for the different government entities and then also the different private entities to agree to make investments in the right places for the long term. One thing I observe, especially, for example, with our wildfire crisis in the West, is that we know all the techniques that are needed to make a difference, but we have the federal government identifying ways to work here, the state governments, and then the local communities. And we need to have all of that integrated as one. And to address this issue of how long it takes to get started, we need to do work that we know will make a difference, and then adapt and learn as we go, compared with making sure we have all the answers first and then getting started. This idea of doing it in a way that immediately creates economic opportunity, for creating jobs for restoration, is also something that adds to the benefit of, pulling together the investments we can make, which can happen through state governments, that can happen more succinctly through the federal government, commit to large-scale outcomes, because the scale of the problem is something that we need to address compared with many small projects in different places that don't add up, and then do it for the long term. And that's when I think we'll see the difference. And that gives us the whole ability to learn as we go, as we discover how well the efforts are working or what science keeps telling us. So the most important thing is to get started, and that requires the commitment of financial resources and policy that can come together from all of these different separate government entities that are trying to address this problem on behalf of their communities.
Yeah, thank you very much. Scale and long term. I think these are two very important notions. There is an interesting
shared
question.
Commitment. The shared commitment
once
of resources.
again, which is very much related to shared commitment, right? Important addition. There is an interesting question that comes from the audience, very much linked to what we have been discussing, whether and how we look at the land equivalent ratio, or we can't continue producing more with less land. And isn't it time to make a diverse crop systems? I don't know whether maybe Andre would respond to this question, and then Matias.
Can I start, Matias? Once again, I have to bring in a Brazilian example, Irina. Only in the Amazon, right, we have about 40 to 50 million hectares. That's a France in area, which is degraded pasture land. So the average head count in those areas, half an animal per hectare. So it's absolutely inefficient from any standpoint that you can see. It's economically inefficiently, it's socially inefficient, it's politically inefficient, it's ecologically inefficient. So it's inefficient from any standpoint that you see. So here's an opportunity. I look at those land, those millions and millions of hectares as an opportunity for intensification. There are many techniques there, and I'm not going to list them here. Matias, I'm sure Bayer dominates many of those technologies, intensifying production, double intercropping, double cropping. I mean, there are many techniques which needs to be incentivized. I think the challenge here, as I mentioned before, I think people need to be informed, and that information in the hands of people, it needs to be translated into incentives. You know, people have to be convinced that, once again, protecting tropical forests is a good business. Intensifying production requires money, requires investment. It costs $1,000 per hectare to intensify ranching in Brazil, for example. So this money has to come from somewhere. It has to come from eventually subsidies, eventually incentives. I mean, just the way we have incentivized, you know, the automobile industry 100 years ago. We have incentivized, you know, the airplane industry, and that's why we're now driving cars and traveling the world, because we have cheap planes and cheap technology to do so. That's the same rationale. We need to shift, you know, from, once again, this extensive process of occupying new land after year into a process in which we produce more in the same area. Technology is available. I'm sure that Matias will talk about it, but we need to incentivize those technology, making sure that the benefits are shared, you know, the development goes in a different direction. So I'm an optimistic by nature. So I'm always trying to convince others that it's possible. And I do believe it's possible.
Would you like to add something, Matthias? And then I would like to turn to Wesson.
I probably would like to build on this with an example that's close to Wesson's home. If we focus on smallholder farmers in Africa and improve their ability to produce food, a country like Nigeria needs to import less food. That gives the country more money to invest in electricity, for example, electrifying rural communities. That reduces the dependencies of those communities on charcoal for cooking, which in turn helps to protect the forests in Central Africa. So these are really simple food systems related interventions. We know they work. And my hope is that between the UN Conference on Food Systems, which will happen this year, and the UN Conference on Water, which will happen in 2023, that in between people talk a lot about forests, because ultimately they are connected to all of those discussions in ways I've not seen any other thing being connected.
Thank you, Matthias. I would turn now to Wesson. There is another question from the audience. We speak about deforestation. What about forestation? I think it's a very legitimate question. And the other one, because we are approaching the end of our debate, I would ask you as a young activist on climate, on protecting biodiversity, on forests, what do you expect from COP26? We know this year that it's a critical gathering of COP26 in Glasgow, and there is a lot of expectations that there will be important decisions taken there by world leaders, political leaders. So what your expectations from that gathering are, please?
All right, thank you so much. And I'm just going to say a plus to what Matthias, Andrea, and Leslie said. It's just like as though we are sharing about the same thing. And then from what they've shared, I see how it's important for us to empower the local communities. And then just like the example Matthias gave about, giving people alternative source of livelihood, but then making sure that the rural communities, indigenous communities really understand why forests must be protected. And that is in terms of like equipping them with knowledge. But then I think the problem we've had with this is how to disseminate this knowledge to these communities that have, they have no internet access. They have no access to some of the amenities that we have access to now, but then how do we reach them? I think that should also be put in place when we are talking about like empowering local communities about knowledge, but how do we share this knowledge among local communities? I think this is one of the things that a lot of these programs need to put in place. And concerning restoration program, I think you said something about afforestation. I think a lot of things is going on about, people planting trees and then just to combat deforestation. But then trust me, I haven't studied trees for a while. I know the amount of years it takes for trees to grow and then to like give us values. So like, even though there are these programs of planting trees and then it's going to really help to restore degraded forests, but then we need to put proper things in place to make sure that the level of deforestation that we've attained around the world right now is something that does not proceed further. you know, we can't, because that we want to like, we have restoration programs in place and then keep on depleting forests. I think I want to see a world where we can halt deforestation for a while we give time for the forests that are growing to grow. I don't know, maybe you understand what I'm saying. So like when we are planning restoration, we should also plan on conservation of the forest that we have left. But then yeah, planting of trees and then restoration programs really go a long way to like bring about all the forest that has been degraded. And concerning COP26, I'm really looking forward. I was part of COP25 and then it was a kind of like, it was time for nature, and then we're hoping that 2020 was going to be a great time for nature, a great time for forests, because we've seen forests discussed in an unprecedented way during COP25. So what I want to see right now is to see forests bring to the table again. And in COP26, I want to see forests discussed and, you know, emphasized on in an unprecedented way, so that everyone knows that the issue that we are discussing is very important, and that forest is as important as any economic development that can happen around the world. And I also want to see youth, young people are doing a lot of things. You know, in Africa, where I come from, we have a lot of young activists that are working towards the restoration of the environment. So I want to see these young people have a special table in the discussion and then in the decision-making table. And also I want to see indigenous community integrated into discussions that relate to forests. So like, it's just a kind of component of like, I'm looking forward to an intergenerational approach to how problems relating to forest and forest management will be solved during COP26. And I'm also looking forward to the high-level discussions that will happen on forests.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your thoughts about the COP26. It's on our minds. What the COP26 will take everybody's warming up to this important meeting. There was a question from the audience, Matthias, about this initiative that you mentioned, launched by the US, Norway, and the UK. Could you just tell us whether it's already in place, creating this fund, or it's in the making?
It's actually in place. So there have been 8 companies committing in addition to the governments. Now in the run-up for Glasgow, of course, it's important to convince more companies to join. The benefit for corporations is that if they commit to decarbonization in a way the UN expects, that those companies can then offset some of their remaining carbon emissions in return for participating. And the idea is that the funds will be made available for communities in tropical and subtropical regions, both for forest protection and, like Andre was talking about, for afforestation strategies as well. So that is basically the innovative part of it. And if you look at leaders in sustainability like Unilever or Nestle, Amazon, the company in this case that has pledged a lot in the space, you can see there are quite a few companies that take this really seriously, part of that. And what I really liked was the leadership of the 3 governments in that space. And the fact that also Secretary Kerry made that a topic important enough for him to advocate for this initiative. So I'd like to see more governments, but most importantly, more businesses that talk about taking climate change seriously to participate here. And Emergent, the organization that is running this program, has started to invite regions and communities to also submit proposals. We need a long time to protect forests, and that's why we need to start now and not talk about it for too long. So this initiative is live.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all. We have approached the end of our discussion. It has been passionate, an amazing contribution of all of you. I would like to say that only through partnerships between governments, the private sector, and you were right, Matias, to mention that it's so important that the private sector that brings a lot of innovation, a lot of investment. We have seen the explosion of green investment recently. The science, Andre made a good point about the importance of science and how what science brings to the protection of biodiversity. Forests in this particular case, the experience, Leslie, that you shared with us of how the government works and how it interacts also with the local communities. And I'm very grateful to Olumaseun because she was ending her sharing thoughts about the COP26, about this intergenerational approach. I think it's very important that we looked at this agenda also from this important lens. Forests are important. We have to have a balanced, sustainable, resilient development in different community societies in different parts of the world. And this is what is at stake, because it's at the end of the day, the future of us all as humanity. Thank you very much for participating in today's debate, and all the best to you.
Thank you, Irina.
Bye-bye, everybody.